Tell us your story. Where did it all start? How did it begin?
Where did it begin? I went to university at Stirling and I did business entrepreneurship, and I was there for 4 years, finished that, and at the time wasn't really too sure what I was going to do afterwards, but I had been helping out on various kind of building sites. Like, people at the time were refurbishing flats. You know, that was a really big thing, that people would buy a flat, do it up, sell it. So it was quite a wee while ago, but that seemed to be a new thing that was going on. And I was involved in lots of kind of labouring and manual kind of tasks, stripping wallpaper, moving bags of rubble, that type of thing. So I was doing that for my uncle. He was involved in, you know, putting in a kitchen, moving it on. And it seemed that when we were doing all this work, often at the end of it, the painting and decorating would get done, but that was always the afterthought, but that was the thing you saw. And I assumed that people were fairly unreliable, they wouldn't turn up, they wouldn't do what they said they would do. So I thought there was maybe an opportunity to do something there. And I got a BlackBerry at the time. That was like a unique selling point, that I could email clients, or they would be not used to having like good communication or understanding that someone would give you a price and they would stick to the price. So it seems fairly innocuous, but that's how it began. So I set up this painting and decorating company, and we got £1,000 from the Prince's Trust, or Prince's Scottish Youth Business Trust, PSYBT, and it set that up. Then quickly grew because we do a good job, we did what we said we would do. Effectively, I read a book which is a college kind of textbook around painting and decorating, but really it's more chemistry. So it would be based on what's the substrate, what's the chemical that you're going to apply, what's the process to make that work, and then people, which was around who are the best people that we could get to actually do the work. I was obviously doing that myself as well, but we grew it to about 10 people, and then it was around about the financial crash, which was 2008, 2007 or 8. And around about then, we were due a lot of money from much bigger clients, so there was a mix of residential work. We used to do all the work for Farrow and Ball, so they sell expensive paint and wallpaper, and if anyone would go into their stores and they were around Scotland, they would get suggested that we could help them out. So we then, I guess at that point, realised the value of channel partnerships. Probably didn't think about them in that way at the time, but how could you get repeat business through ongoing relationships? All of that was like residential work, but at the same time had commercial. And on the commercial side, that was like building sites, much larger kind of commercial type work, whether it was in a hotel, bars, that type of thing. And the companies who we were working for and doing that, we were a very small piece of the pie, so we were in as a subcontractor at the very end part of the jobs. And when the crash happened, there was a bunch of companies went bust, or you know, they didn't pay, or we didn't get paid in the end. So that was difficult to deal with, and as a result, the business that I had at the time, that went bust. Everyone was made redundant. We had to pay back everything to HMRC, cover off all the tax. So my experience of having gone through that then led to how could you reduce the chance of that happening for other businesses. If it happened to us, it could happen to, or well, it does happen to many other businesses. And could you make it faster and easier for people to get access to legal advice? Like, how could you navigate your way through the process? It's time consuming, expensive, and it's complex. So the idea was, well, could we do something with software that would help people navigate their way through that? How do you find a solicitor? Should you even be going to court? In my case, we did go to court, and in one scenario we got a piece of paper, like the judgment from court, to say, yeah, you're in the right, you should go and claim this money back. But there was no money to claim back, there were no assets from the other business to go and claim. Okay. So I'd experienced that, and you know, that led to, could we drastically change the way that people or businesses interact with legal services? So to get from that to where we are today, we built a very basic beta product which was based with some help from the data lab. So as they were getting started, we were the first funded project from the data lab.
Wow.
They were linked to Edinburgh Uni, and as that was getting started, we got some funding to bring together the computer science and legal schools within Strathclyde Uni to look at this search tool. So the basis was, could I key in some information about a problem? So say I bought a car and the gearbox failed, and did this fall under the Consumer Rights Act? What does that say? And could you then pull out the right subsection or area of the Consumer Rights Act? And then from there, could you match it with case law? So the idea being that as a consumer or as a business owner, I could go somewhere, share a bit of information, a bit like a triage, and then match. If you pursue this, you should go to the Sheriff Court in Edinburgh. You will go through the simple procedure, like here's what you'll do to map it out. So we built out this very basic beta, and I got a scholarship, or not a scholarship, a fellowship with the Royal Society. So I worked for a year. I was had a salary, and I went through their programme as a fellow in their entrepreneurship kind of scheme that they have. So we went through that as a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and I was looking at commercialising machine learning in the legal sector. So I had a year of looking into all the logistics of how would this work, what would you do, how would you manage to build up a big enough data set to make it actually valuable. And then when we took it out to the market, what we found was that actually there was a bigger upstream problem, which was the compliance aspect of know your client, all the regulations around onboarding a new client, who are they, and then all the anti-money laundering implications of that.
Yeah.
So once we had actually engaged with the market, the solicitors we were talking to, we had thought we could give them this tool, which was a search, so we could let all these consumers or business owners key in all their information, and we could then funnel them towards lawyers and say, oh, look, here's a potential case, here's the outline of the case, here's potentially the chance of success, what's going to happen. And they said, well, even if you did pass these 500 leads effectively, but like a lead magnet, you could pass us all these leads, but we would then need to go through all this compliance to decide, is this person who we think they are they trying to loan their money, is this a front for something else, who are they, should we take on the client, is it worth their while? And the feedback was then, well, there isn't actually an end-to-end platform that manages all of this digitally, and you couldn't do it. So at the time, that was about maybe 6 years ago, everything was all paper and you couldn't conceivably do this digitally. So we went to the Law Society of Scotland and said, what do you think about, we could come in and help make this easier for solicitors. We could change the way that they engage with their clients and do it digitally. And initially they were like, well, maybe let's keep the conversation going. And
Crazy
then,
idea.
Yeah, and then after a little while of saying, we are going to do this, we're going to progress this, we've now got a strategic partnership to support the Scottish legal profession with technology to help them deliver their services digitally. So there's a lot of different aspects to that now, but we've got a really good ongoing partnership with Law Society of Scotland as a result. But this all came from the initial pain point that I had, trying to solve our way through it, met various people along the way, and then that's led us to where we are now, which were 45 people serving government, regulators, 400 or 500 law firms, wealth management. So it's quite a broad array of stuff that we're now able to do, but that's, it ultimately came from, could we make it simple for people to engage with legal services?
It's amazing kind of connecting the dots, going backwards. When you had that must have been such a tough time when you went out of business back in, was it 2008?
Yeah, it was really tough. I mean, I went, as my friends were progressing through careers and doing stuff, everything was sold. So all of the equipment we had, all the vans, everything went. I moved back into my bedroom with my mum and dad. So having moved out and then moved on,
yeah.
I then went back to living at home again. So that was a bit of a kind of awakening of that didn't work. And the idea of, oh yeah, you're an entrepreneur, like, can you spell entrepreneur? To then, oh, that's failed, or what are you going to do now? Go and get a job. You know, that the scenario of like, you know, that was never going to work, was it? To then say, well, okay, well, I've learned from that, like, you know, or understand why that had happened. Ultimately, whether the financial crash had happened or not, like, that's still ultimately my mistake, or like a series of poor decisions that lead into the point that, you know, you're over concentrated with larger clients who, you know, they're not paying us, cash flow is really difficult, the margins are really tight, we're in our overdraft with the bank withdrew the overdraft. So there's like a whole range of things that led into the business failing, because fundamentally, you know, we would get paid 60 or 90 days, but we were paying everyone their wages every week.
Right.
But then when you had like a consecutive number of large clients not paying us, it's like it just wasn't sustainable. We couldn't keep going. So it was really tough, but loads of lessons learned. And when I had finished that, I had like this residential order book of clients who did want us to do the work. We just couldn't, we didn't have the equipment, we didn't have the number of people, we didn't have any of that. But they had then said, well, okay, so rather than the job taking a week and there being 3 people on site, it's going to take you 3 weeks and there's going to be 1 person. But please still arrive and come and do it. So we built up the order book and we had about 100 grand, and I sold that to a local competitor and said, look, here's all this work. I can't do it all, but you know, I can make the introduction. So over a period of time, you know, I got a small amount of money from that as we kind of passed it on. And then I spent some time in London and retrained as a mediator, so dealing with like out of court disputes, like conciliation, negotiation. Wow. And I learned a lot from that. So that was civil and commercial and workplace and employment mediation. So that was understanding like dealing with disputes and challenges.
Was there something that kind of drew you towards that, or is it something?
It was when I had been through the court process, I wasn't actually aware that mediation was a route. So it's a, you know, it's a non-court based way to resolve a situation. So you're not going to get a judgment from court, but you could get together and find like, is there a meaningful way forward? And then I started to volunteer for Citizens Advice that are based in Edinburgh Sheriff Court, and I would do mediation, which was pro bono, like you're not being paid a fee for it. But again, you would learn loads. There was one scenario where it was a telephone mediation. So I was in court in Edinburgh and there was someone had arrived, and the example was that they would bring their case and it would get called in court, and then the sheriff would say, oh, this would be suitable for mediation, you know, and I strongly suggest you should go and do that. It's not mandated, you're not going to be forced to do it, but you can be strongly suggested. So they'd been sent from court, and they'd then arranged this telephone mediation, and it was based on someone on eBay who had sold a mint condition MacBook box, not a MacBook, but the box, for £500. So the person who had bought the MacBook box, it was in perfect condition, it was a great box, there was no MacBook inside it, and they'd sold it for £500. So the person who was on the phone, you know, the assumption is, oh, they're a fraudster, what are they up to? And he was saying, look, some people really like packaging, and like he was going down this route of like, well, you know, I advertised it, you should have read the advert, I sent you what I said I was selling. And the other person's like in this little office or this little room in the Sheriff Court, and I'm sat there in the middle where I'm impartial, I'm not going to suggest the actual outcome, and you know, it's not for me to like intervene and say what's going to happen. Yeah. But I was sitting there during that thinking, oh my, like I don't know how long I can do this, like I'm not going to do this for forever. And then that kind of led into the conversation about, well, how could you use technology to do this at scale? Because with the mediation side of things, I would be there as a consultant, and you would have a number of jobs in any given month, but it was never going to be something at the time that was going to be sustainable. So I was able to chat to a friend, he was at Free Agent, so again like 5 or 6 years ago. It's they're an Edinburgh based tech company who manage online bookkeeping. Effectively it's like a platform if you're in it, B2B, or you're like effectively a business who needs to manage all of your accountancy stuff. You can do it all in Free Agent. It's a great product. They got bought by or they listed the name and then they got bought. But prior to that, I'd said to him, look, you're a product designer, like, what do you think about this idea? Do you think we could do it? And he said, yeah, I think it's just, a great idea, like, but I won't be able to build this myself, but I do know a few people who you should chat to. So then that led the ball rolling, and then met up with a couple of people who they were in, Rick and Steve, who co-founded the business with. They're based in Cambridge, so I went down and met them, had a chat about, here's this idea, don't have any funding, don't have any money, here's what the idea is, and then that set off the next few steps around, raising investment and getting support and grants and all the rest of it.
So you usually raised investment pre-revenue, pre-tech? Or?
When we didn't, I don't think we had anything built, but we went to the Scottish Edge. I think Scottish Edge had just arrived, like, on the scene, this funding competition where you could present like what you propose you were going to do, and you need to put together an application and a pitch video. And the first time I think it's like, nah, this is nonsense, and it never went anywhere. And then we applied again, and there was like the young edge, the wildcard edge, then the main edge, so they split it into categories. And then we got the young edge, so I was maybe, I think, 25 or something, so I was under a certain age bracket, you can go young edge. And then we presented it, and looking back at the materials, like the pitch materials and the stuff that we did now, it's funny looking at it and thinking, oh my god. So we got the young edge, I think that was £10,000, and that was then, okay, what can we do, what can we build with the very basic MVP with that? Yeah. And then after that we came back and said, okay, here's what, you gave us the credibility with that first chunk, here's what we've done since then. And then we got the wildcard edge, which is still a bit like, sounds a bit mad, but maybe it'll go somewhere. Then we got that. And then after that we went back, and then the main edge, I think it was 100 grand. And then at the time when we got that, we were able to leverage that with, I think there was some Scottish enterprise support at the time. And then I had the RSE fellowship. And then we did a round of external kind of angel investment where a couple of people came in. So Gav, who used to run Kotican, he had sold Kotican to Fanduel at the time, and then he came in as the first investor. And then Robin, they'd recently went from Intelligent Point of Sale to iZettle, so iZettle bought them, and then in that period between iZettle buying them, they were then bought by PayPal. So both of those people had we'd been in touch, like, or knew one another very kind of loosely, but based in Leith, doing something in tech, and then said, here's what we're doing, like, what do you think about coming in? And then we obviously got the benefits of the SEIS, so we kind of went through all that kind of tax efficient stuff that typically in Scotland angel investors would want to go through. So we picked up angel investors at that time where we'd probably just got a product to market, so probably around 2018, where we had one or two early adopting clients, and then we were able to build the business from there.
Fantastic, man. And what was that like, going through your first raise and having no experience in it? Did you have like a mentor or someone to take you through that process?
When we did the very first time round, that was with, I think it was just Robin and Gav that did it, and it was very straightforward. There wasn't anything that was like complex, so we just arrived at the valuation of the business at the time, pre-revenue, where were we at, and that was quite straightforward. And then it was probably roundabout then, Sir Sandy Crombie came on as our chairman, so he used to run Standard Life Group, and when I was doing the painting company, painted his house.
Oh, hey.
So he had been introduced by like one of our partners that said they had the XYZ job coming up, and then so I'd met Sir Sandy through that, and had said at the time we were outside on scaffolding for about 2 months, just like scraping, burning off paint, like starting from scratch and doing all that. And we used to have a Monday morning meeting for a coffee in the kitchen before he was like heading off to work or doing things, and saying, okay, right, here's what we plan to do this week, here's what we're going to do, and like and after a while, once we got to know him a wee bit, I'd said, I'm not going to do this forever, and I'm thinking about setting up this technology company, and here's what we're going to do. And he's a bit like, all right, let me know when you've got that going. So gradually, as we did get that going, I then went back and said, here's what we've done. And the Scottish Edge competition, that was linked closely with RBS, so John Swinney had put in some Scottish Government money, and then RBS backed it, and they've hosted it ever since. So Sandy was aware of Scottish Edge and had said, look, we've had this validation that we've been through this process, like there is something here. I went, when I went to go and pitch it to him, it was there was RBS offices at the time that are on St Andrew's Square, and it's like thick, deep blue pile carpet. It's like you kind of like lose your foot in the carpet when you get in. And then when I arrived, there was someone at the door, like a security person. Had said, I'm here to see Sir Sandy, and I probably had a pair of trainers on, and I wasn't like dressed in a suit or anything. Like to me, like, I don't know if Sir Sandy Crumby's expecting you. Anyway, so I went up and had a cup of tea, and I'd pitched it, and I think I'd got a couple of minutes in. He was like, I'm gonna have to stop. If this was Dragon's Den, there's absolutely no way. Like I am out. Like this isn't. I think you need to think about how can you better articulate this. So initially, he was maybe a bit sceptical, but over time it was then he then came on to support us as our chairman. He still is our chairman, and obviously a big part of the work that we're doing from a governance perspective and running the board. So that was from kind of early mentorship. Back to your question, when we did that first round of funding, it was more that Gav and Robin had been through that before, so they were able to kind of set expectations and be like, right, here's the documentation we're going to look at. It wasn't like extremely thorough, but then since then we've done maybe 4 rounds. Like we've done kind of little and often. Here's the milestones we're going to hit the milestones, and then go off and do it again. Oh, great!
Wow. So going back to the first raise, you then start to grow Amiqus, and do you bring in more people? Or what's the first thing you do at that stage?
So we went from Rick and Steve, who had mentioned they were in Cambridge, and they were doing things on a consultancy basis, so they still had all their other work. They were running an agency, so kind of product development agency, and they came in to do some work. So we had a little bit of funding to do that, and then just very gradually we had people come in. So whether it was like, I guess at the time, you know, looking back, you're reflecting it now that everyone's a generalist and there is no specialism. It's like, right, we're going to have to answer support tickets, we're going to have to do marketing, we're going to have to do who's putting out the comms for the product release, who's doing X, Y and Z. And at that stage in an early stage tech company, you're really looking for people who are able to just go and get it done in whatever the task is. And it's very general. And then just over time, you obviously become more specialist in different things. That's kind of where we're at now, where people have maybe generalised and done a lot of different things. You're now specialised. So there's people who have been around since then, who are now in completely different roles. So they've been with Amiqus for like 4 or 5 years, and they've just progressed steadily all the way through. So Lucy, who's in the team, she started out she would do product demos, she would talk to clients, she would help clients get set up, manage Zendesk, or we're using Intercom at the time, that's like support ticketing. And now she's doing a business analyst role, so she's far more focused around data, reporting, you know, management, information, and her role's just entirely changed. So she was there with us very early on, and at the same time there were other people who were able to join. Really, where the money went was about 80%, it still is, of our cost, our investment is in people. So although you're a technology company, it's like it's all people. Like there's very, very little other cost that we have. We're predominantly remote, so we've got offices in Leith, but there's people spread out: Belfast, London, Glasgow, Cambridge, Bristol. Like it was spread out all over the place, across the UK predominantly. But again, we'll come together. At the moment we're doing that 6 monthly for an all hands event, so that's coming up. But yeah, almost all of the cost and all the investment is people.
And how does it affect you going from, you know, just yourself and a couple others to like a big team? Like reflecting back on my kind of story, we've been around for about 4.5 years now. And I like to remember the days of like when you had 10 people and communication was like so easy. Like everyone just knew what you were doing automatically, right? And there was total alignment, and there wasn't like communicated Slack messages and that sort of thing, right? How's it been for you?
Yeah, it's been like a constant change. Like that's something we've recognised. definitely so that what worked at 10 won't necessarily work at 15 or 20, and what works at 20 won't work at 30, what works at 30 won't work at 40. So we did a bunch of work with Mark Logan. He used to be the Chief Operating Officer at Skyscanner, and he came in and did a session and was calling it like the trough of disillusionment. So it was like you kind of go up and then you go like that, and then you'll come back up again and you go like that, and it's at the different inflection points in the number of people or the scale that you're at. And communication is just the biggest bit of it. So making sure people understand like what's the company's objective, what you're working on in a team. One of the changes we made more recently was to move to cross-functional teams. So prior to having engineering and then marketing or sales and then product, and having it all broken off into these silos where like, I am an engineer and I will work on this thing because this is critically important. And then you've got someone else over here who's engaging with clients to like, well, our clients really need this thing. So we've moved it around now. So we've split out into teams where you'll have an engineer and you'll have a user researcher and you'll have a designer and you'll have a business development person to bring in all these like areas of expertise so that we can be aligned towards, right, this is the key result we're working towards in this 2-month or this 3-month period, here's how we're going to do it. And you're not asking someone to like work off the corner of a desk to try and do it whilst they're trying to do the other work they have. So we've got like a core and API team who are working on like the fundamentals of the reliability, the uptime of the platform. Do we have the infrastructure in place that can scale? At the same time, we've then got like acquisition and growth who are looking at attracting and bringing in new clients and what we're doing to work more in an experimental way to do that. So that's been one of the things that we've changed recently, but it's not easy because people still associate with how they might have done things before, and changing roles, or as we bring in more kind of specialist roles, like that's the same thing that you might have previously done these tasks, but now we've got a specialist in who's able to do that. So you don't need to worry about that anymore. You don't need to think about that thing anymore, and it's just not possible because there's just so many different things going on that within your own team you should just focus on what's happening there. And we've got oversight over what's happening across all the teams, but communication is like such a tricky thing.
That kind of focus and alignment it can give you for cross-functional teams is like so important now. Like when I was many years ago, I was just a software developer.
Right.
You're working as part of like a bench of software developers, I guess. And you'd pick up your ticket that had come from a business analyst somewhere that you don't really talk to, and you just pick up a ticket and go and interpret what they've written and then build it, pass it to testers that would then make sure it works according to the ticket, then it would go live, and that's not what the customer wanted. So one of the things we do at Clear Sky Logic now is we talk to people that normally had outsourced like software developers, and they maybe get IT contractors in, and they'd just be thrown into a product and say just build what you can. It's like, that's like definitely not the way to do it, right? So we go on like a product development team. So you've got UX, UI designers, software architects, software developers, QA testers, so everything needed to build hook them up with like a product owner in a company. Then we can build what's really needed as a cross-functional team. It sounds like you've got to the same answer that we got to it.
Yeah, and it's managing that internally. There's another one, like it's a different scenario, but one of the things we did ages ago was bring in a dedicated internal recruiter, and that was a thing of like, well, what do we need? Are we going to go externally for that? Like, is it going to be simply fill in a role, or does the person have the right context and understanding of this is the type of thing we need to do? Is this the right person? Do they have the right skills or the right kind of behavioural traits? Like, what is it that we need here? So that was something that I remember at the time, it was like, oh, do you really need a dedicated person managing that yet? But yeah, I think that was like a good decision to make, and so well, you need to understand the nuance of that, whether it's like you're developing a bit of software or a product or whatever. If you don't have that general like cross-functional understanding of like what's going on in that team, then it's so difficult. And one of the things even now is like making sure that as an engineer joining the client call to hear what the actual need or the pain point is very different when you get it third hand, and it's like, oh yeah, here's what we're trying to solve against. But when you hear it on the call, when you're there, like it's just very different. So there's so many, I think, examples of that where if people can understand, or they really are very clear on like what it is we're doing, why we're doing it, what's all the expectations, then you're always going to get a better outcome. Whether it's like hiring people or it's like shipping product, it's like making sure people are very clear and aligned is the thing. So, you know, whether it's at the moment 40 people or whether it's like 100 people, like making sure at the moment we've set it to a maximum of 12 people, so between 10 and 12 people for that team size. But if it gets past 10, we then start to look at how can we break it out further, you know, how can we break the team up.
Or even just the focus at that point if you need another team, right? Like,
yeah,
you know,
when do you make
should we be doing all these things at the same time?
Yeah, and you know, the acquisition and growth team breaking out to be like acquisition is on its own and growth is another, or onboarding and retention becomes an onboarding team and a retention team. And do we have enough engineers, designers and people to be able to do that yet? When do you make the break point?
Yeah.
And there's never any right or wrong answers, but it's just trying to get it as best you can, like before, you know, things start to break down or there's challenges. But yeah, it'll be the same, I'm sure, from 40 to 60 or 60 to 80. It's going to be the same stuff, just figuring it all out again.
So I'd contemplated having like a full-time recruitment person as part of the team. I didn't take the plunge, but I always looked at it, that might. How have you found that? Is it been what you thought it'd be like? So
the person that came in initially to do that, they were at a recruitment company, and we'd said, look, this is more like a people role. So there's a recruitment aspect, but then there's also helping and managing our people. So whether that's like, you know, more as a kind of line manager or dealing with one-to-ones and that kind of thing, you would be the central person that people are going to come to, and managing that. And they've moved into an entirely different role now. But Tasha, who's doing it now, she's there as a people and engagement manager. So she again came from a recruitment background, came in, but she's really passionate about the people side of things. So dealing, like, whether it's more of this kind of CIPD, you know, qualifications around HR and managing some of that. And then we've also got a culture and comms manager. So Laura's in a senior role doing that, and again it's just like an overlap between the two roles of like internal comms as well as how we're managing, or if there's something that crops up that seems like it could be dealt with before it kind of escalates into a problem, what changes can we make or what things can we put in place. So we spent the last 6 months kind of company building, so we've obviously been adding new clients and doing a lot with the platform from a kind of technical point of view, but we spent a big chunk of time looking at how can we make sure that we're building in a sustainable way, so we're growing but not at all costs. And the biggest part of that is for people, so that people aren't burnt out, and people who are in a kind of manager role feel like they've been supported and they've got the training to do that. So we've set up 2 tracks, so an IC track for individual contributor and then a manager track, so you could progress as a dedicated software engineer, and you really don't want to manage people, so you don't need to be managing a team for like a project point of view, or you don't need to be managing all of the one-to-ones, or like as a line manager you don't need to do that. You can just solely focus on being a really good engineer, for example, and you could progress. So by putting in Tasha in that role as people engagement, it's meant that we've had the dedicated focus to cover off all the recruitment requirements and making sure that, you know, people are a good match, they're going to come in and be well placed for the role, but at the same time when they come in, what's the onboarding experience like, is that organised, how are people getting settled into their team, have we got all the right things in place. So I think it's definitely an investment based on the team or the people, but then all these things just link together. So it's definitely been a big positive. And then the question is then, at what stage, at what point do you then need an additional person, like a kind of internal kind of, not community manager, but the idea that you've then got another person who's able to then support. So we've not got HR as like a centralised function. It's been more, can we help people deliver that into their individual teams? So yeah, there is central support if you need it, but let's move it out so you've got trained, competent people who are, like everyone who's in a line manager role's had mental health first aid training, so you would know what are the kind of signs to spot early on if someone's having a difficult time. What would you do? How would you escalate it? How would you manage an incident? So there's various things that we've put in which should mean that anyone who's in a line manager role feels supported, but we wouldn't have been able to do it if we didn't have someone who's dedicated to help you actually set it all up, and it takes a lot of time to do that alongside putting in place a competency framework to say, right, you know, what does level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like what are the behaviours that you would you know, be expected to meet. It's just a lot of work to do it, but now that we've put that in place, it's of huge positive benefit, because you can then see how you can progress. It's not, oh, I'm going to send Callum 5 Slack messages a week and say how great I am, and then I'm going to get a promotion. Like, that's not really it. It's like we've got a process to run through that, you know, there's a calibration set up towards that, so it's really clear that, you know, if you're doing a great job, that will be recognised, and there's lots of opportunity to progress. And that's not just purely around the recruitment angle, but having people in place who are focused on that means that overall, you know, we should be in a better position to help people progress.
And that sounds amazing. Where did the idea for the investment, or you know, where did the initiative come to do that as like a key cornerstone?
That came from, I think, the idea of putting it in place. Like, we knew that we'd kind of got to a point where we would need like something more documented. So there's a bunch of people in the team who've been in like much larger organisations and have always been looking for structure and process. And in early stage companies, like, you'll know, like, that isn't as much. It's like, okay, let's just get the job done.
Yeah.
So it was more of a reflection on like where we are at a point in time. Like I mentioned, Mark Logan had come in and said, look, here are the common things that sink a startup. Here are the things that usually cause a problem. You should be thinking about X, Y, and Z. And then we spent a bit of time working with Gail Kiriego, who she used to be head of people at Skyscanner, and has supported a whole bunch of different early stage tech companies thinking through this stuff. So once we'd spent a bit of time with her, it was then obvious, like, yeah, we did have to do this work, but there was just so much of it to consider and think about, like the competency framework bit a bit. Then there was like the salary bandings, how do you manage that? How do you manage like a 6-monthly review process and 360 feedback, and like loads of different things that went into that. But it must have come from, I think, the initial work that we did, because we were trying to get out ahead. You know, things are going well, and we're thinking there must be something that's just around the corner that's going to get us. Like, what is it?
Like a pandemic?
Yeah, there might be a bloody global pandemic.
Or a recession, is it? Yeah. The next recession?
The next, whatever's next. So we kind of knew there would be something.
Yeah.
And there always is. But could we get out ahead of it? And sometimes we've done things a little bit early. So we've put in ISO 27001 maybe like 3 years in. We didn't have many people, but we knew to try and retrofit ISO 27001 would be a huge pain, loads of process change. How do you do it? So we made that decision really early on, and that stood us in great stead, because loads of our clients are regulated by either the FCA or the SRA or the law society or whoever, and there's an expectation to manage that properly. So now that we're in the public sector, there's a whole heap of things that we need to think about, but we've got all of it in hand because we took a good look at all of that early on. So it meant that the time and the investment and effort that went in to do it early on has stood us in good stead now, where we supply all of the software to manage the compliance for any new staff coming into the Scottish Government, whether it's temp or permanent. So having supported a government with that, it then means that we were then able to go off and do that for the NHS. And when COVID hit, we then went through like an open tender process to help them, and we ran, or there was an area of the NHS that used us to support their bring back key workers into the NHS, and they won internal awards for how efficient and fantastic it was. So we wouldn't have been able to win government, get into the NHS, or roll out with a whole host of other things if we hadn't done all that compliance work early on.
And it's quite so we got ISO 27001 just a year and a half ago maybe. But that was from clients basically saying, it's like here's the procurement process. We can tick this box here. We've got ISO, or we've got all this stuff we need to do. And we're like really sort that out. And then previously in our career, we'd help larger companies get when we were employees and stuff. But yeah, so I know it's kind of the benefit, you get intangible benefit that you'll get later on. It's just it's a good thing to do when you're smaller, right?
Yeah, definitely. There's one we're doing right now, which is the UK government's Digital Identity and Attributes Trust Framework. bit of a mouthful, but effectively what that means is we'll have a little rubber stamp, a bit like the direct debit logo or a CE mark, to say that we are a provider of digital identity that can be reused, and it's to the standard that's set by government. So it means that anyone who could come in and interact with Amiqus would be able to then keep those credentials and then reuse them for other scenarios. So you could come into Amiqus because the lawyer you're working with, you're moving home, and they'll ask you to prove your identity as part of their compliance work they need to do around anti-money laundering. So once you've done that, you would then be able to put that in a wallet and then reuse it. So if you were then moving job and then you were asked to then do a disclosure check or prove who you are, prove your right to work, you've already done that. And we've now got a network of about 500 different businesses who already rely on us to do this. So we're now going from this tool to a network where you could engage with Amiqus, whether you're talking to a lawyer, you could get legal help, you could talk to an accountant, it could be for wealth management, like you could be creating a pension, but you've created this digital identity credential and you can reuse it. But to get on this framework and go through all the stuff, there was like ISO 27001 and like a whole host of other stuff that meant if you've done that, then you tick the box and you can progress. So there's stuff around accessibility, so external assessment to WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, is around the standard in the public sector of what you must be able to demonstrate for people who have accessibility requirements, whether it's using a screen reader or whatever the impairment or the challenge is. Again, we went through that work to say, well, we should be accessible. It shouldn't be just for a certain demographic or a certain person who's like, a very straightforward use case. So having considered all of that, it then means that we're now in a really good position.
So do you have to go back and redo bits of UX UI to make that accessible?
Yeah, that's right. So some of it was based on like looking at the standards that whether GDS would have, and you look at some of the guidelines that they would provide. So how, when you hover over a bit of text, like what you provided, or what's the colour when you interact with someone, does it, have you got a black border or a yellow border, or various things around how simple it is to get your way through a process, and if you hit a dead end, like how can you navigate your way through it. So there was a bunch of work to do where we then go back and review what we've got, how could we improve it, and update all of our accessibility statements, that type of thing. And we're going through an assessment at the moment. So we had to do that through the Scottish Government before we went live. So they've got an assessment called the D1. So it's digital first, and when you go through that, it's a rigorous process to look at how you serve up your service, what that meets as far as like accessibility needs. And we learned loads in doing it because we were like, I hadn't really appreciated that or thought about that. So there was a lot of work there from user experience as well as design to think about how could we make it better. But that's for the benefit of everyone, because having gone through that now, it then means that anyone who's interacting with Amiqus gets the benefit of that. Yeah,
it's like a snowball effect, isn't it? So you've had such an interesting journey, we could be here for like hours, but in terms of, what was the biggest challenge for you personally? Like, outside the kind of ISO certification, like as a person, how did you go from having that, in 2008 when disaster struck, to growing back, and now you've got a super fast growing SaaS company? What was it taking of you?
I think all the way through it, there's always this scenario or expectation that you don't know what you're doing, this won't work because of X reason. So going from university into painting and decorating was, you don't have a trade, like you haven't been to college for 4 years, like you don't have your ticket, like you don't, like what do you know? How can you do that? But the idea was, well, I don't need to know that much because we're going to bring in other people who are expert in these areas. I'll bring where I'm good, and we'll bring in other people who are good at the other bits. So you need to be able to do so much of whatever the challenge is, and then bring in other people. And then when we went from, you're doing the painting, to then the mediation, is like, again, you're not a solicitor, you're a non-lawyer. There's this thing about, you couldn't possibly be a mediator because you're not a lawyer. And that
just watch Suits a lot.
Yeah. So it's a similar thing of like, you can't possibly do this. And then when it went into tech, it was like, well, you're not an engineer, so you can't possibly do it. So all the way through, I think there's like a healthy dose of kind of skepticism, or like in Scotland, whether it's good or bad, like the idea that it's a very different environment. So if we were in the west coast of America, everyone's like, oh yeah, this is amazing, like, oh, go for it, like, this is fantastic. Whereas like you'd be very skeptical and be like, does not sound like it's going to go anywhere. So if you can navigate your way through that, it's just like the resilience that you need to kind of continually just develop, of like, right, we're just going to keep going. People are going to like kind of be the naysayers and say why, you'll give you all the reasons why this won't work, but just keeping going, and you know, one step to the next step, like that's, you know, it's tiring. Like there's no getting away from it, and being constantly told that this thing's never going to work, whether it's, you know, an investment round and folk are like, oh well, we don't have the metrics to evidence this new valuation. It's like, okay, well, we're going to prove you wrong, we're going to, you know, do this, we're going to get X, Y and Z. Then there was one that we did, and we had like the Scottish Government, and someone was like, well, for a start, I'm just going to discount any of this stuff about the public sector, because there's no way that you're going to go live with the Scottish Government, and even if you do go live, you're never going to repeat that. This is not viable, this is a complete nonsense. I remember thinking like, what are you talking about? Like, this is so obviously going to happen. Like, I was just so clear in my mind that we were definitely going to win the Scottish Government opportunity, and we were definitely going to make it repeatable. And even after we got the second one, which was NHS BSA, they're like a centralised HR shared service, then it was like, okay, so you've done it once, you've done it twice, it's not repeatable yet, you're not proven it yet. And then we got the third one, and then we're rolling that out to all local authorities, and then you kind of see people then realise, oh, maybe you can do that. Yeah. So I think the idea that, you know, just continuing on, like taking that hit or taking it on the chin when somebody's always going to have something to like kind of push back on and say you can't do X or Y, like that's probably, you know, it is tiring, and like having to manage that. See my dog's just away around the
Harris.
He was so good for.
He's good, huh? We're nearly off anyway.
So yeah, I think the tricky thing is like just kind of keeping it going, like, and it's the people stuff's hard as well, because you know, you're dealing with like, whether it's 10 people, 20 people, 30, 40, there's so much stuff going on in people's lives, like outside of work. It's like knowing like what's the best kind of work that suits that particular character type. We did a really good thing which is called Clifton Strengths, and that was like an exercise to look at the character traits of everyone and understand, like, you know, what teams might they be best suited in, and just dealing with that, like, so recognising, okay, so this person's, where I see opportunity, they see risk, great. Probably best in the business ops team, looking at like the risk side of things and managing eyes or whatever that might be, and dealing with that as you go. So I think, yeah, just recognising like what's the strengths of people, but as well, you individually always kind of just pushing through and like getting it done and moving things forward. We're now.
Where does that resilience and passion come from? Why do you want to do this?
Dogs in the bin. That, I think for me, like, it's never been about, oh, we're at like whatever the revenue number is, so we went double, and then we tripled revenue last year, then we're going to double this year.
Well, that might be a pattern.
Yeah, there's a pattern. But I remember when although that sounds great as a throwaway comment of we went double, triple, when we did those first two doubles, we had set a really high expectation with investors of what we were going to do in that year. We didn't hit it. So it's all right now saying, oh yeah, we doubled revenue that year, but the expectation was we were going to like quadruple or sextuple or whatever it was going to be. So at the time it was like, yeah, you've missed. You set a high expectation. You know, if you do that, you're going to have to meet it. But for me, it's never really been about the kind of revenue number. We need to do that to grow, and like the evidence we're going to progress. And the more revenue we generate, the more impact that we can have. So we're a purpose-driven business. We want to do things to make like access to legal services possible. But for that to actually happen, like, we need to grow. but the kind of passion or the kind of drive behind it is really just to solve the problem. So we're so far away from actually making it simple to prove who you are, engage and manage something digitally online, and then get access to that help or that product or that service. Like, we've made strides towards that, but there's just so much more to do. So we're very early on in the journey, although we're now, what will be 7 years in July since we went to Company's House and actually put the name in and set it up. We've been in the market for maybe like 3.5 years, something like that, from actually building and getting it going and going from the MVP. But yeah, the intention is at the moment we're about 2.5 million in revenue, but we would expect to be about 5 next year, so again do the double. But really, in a SaaS business, this next inflection point is getting past 10.
Right.
So once you're past 10 million, it's almost inevitable that from 10 you're going to get to 100. It's hard to say like how quickly you're going to do it, but that was something that is just going to become very obvious. But there's a lot of companies in Scotland particularly, for one reason or another, they'll sell early or they'll be acquired, however you want to phrase it. But we don't have any expectations of just selling a business anytime soon, because we've got lots of problems to solve. So it's much more about the long term. How can we grow a scalable business that can have a big impact and give me an important business and here for the long run? So more focused on that, and it's definitely like more of an endurance event than it is a sprint. So yeah, I think because there's a big problem to solve, and that's like why we set the business up to solve it. It was never let's get to an imaginary number and then sell it. Like that wasn't it. We will return capital to our investors and thank them for all of their belief and support that they've provided along the way, but we think about stakeholders more broadly. So there's like our shareholders, but then there's our local environment, there's our team, there's lots of other things to take into account and consider, but we will return all that capital back to the shareholders, but we've got a lot of stuff to do before we do that. But yeah, really much more see it driving it well past the 100 million and saying, great, like we've built a business at scale, but there's so much more to do, and the market opportunity is absolutely massive. So there's no question about the opportunity that exists, but it's more so like the number of problems to be solved, and making sure that we do that in a kind of measured, kind of methodical way that's sustainable. Like I mentioned earlier, we're not growing at all costs, so it's not, there are some companies where they've got a pretty toxic culture, but they will be like the fastest growing company in the country or in Europe or whatever. That's great. Like good for them, like they can go ahead and do that, but it's not great for the people who are involved in the business for various, like their own health or their own relationships or the stuff that they've got going on. Something's got to give.
That sounds like, it's amazing your take on that, and it's a very kind of ethical way for the business to grow. Where does that come from? Why is that so important to you?
We've always thought about building things purposefully, and doing things right, like thinking of like using business as a force for good. Like I don't think it's a brand new concept, like that's been around for quite a while, but it's been evidenced that businesses that are purpose driven are more effective, like are more profitable, are more sustainable. Like the idea that there's like a very clear mission, vision, values, like how we're actually going to deliver that, not just we're going to drive X percentage profit out of this back book of clients and we're going to hit this number, and nobody's really that interested in that. Like we do hold ourselves accountable monthly to our investors, and we'll share all of our metrics and stats. So we've got a board meeting this week, so we will be talking about like what did we say we would do, what did we hit, did we achieve this, why did we not, what's the plan, what are you doing next. So there's like very clear like accountability around like metrics and financials, but at the same time it's like, well, what are we doing more broadly than that? So like what impact are we having, what good are we doing? So an example of that would be we're partnering with the Scottish Refugee Council for the next 3 years to say, well, we can provide match funding from all of our people. Scottish Refugee Council are a far better place to say where that's divvied up, where does it go, what impact can they have, and at the same time, can we make our products simple and easy for people regardless of where they're coming from or how long they've been here, so they can access things. And then on the other side of that is like all of the equipment. So the example that, you know, we lease laptops and then they depreciate to a certain point that, you know, they're there and they just get replaced and they get cycled out and, you know, a new laptop comes along. But that could be really useful for, you know, a community project that they're running where people need to have access to the internet and like get on and do stuff. So we could partner with them and do something that's valuable. I guess to try and answer the question, like where does it come from? I'm not really too sure. I think just the idea that we've definitely got a responsibility to, you know, set an example and do things. To some extent, the last maybe 5 years, you've seen like a total meltdown in public life of like the standards that people hold themselves accountable to, whether it's like ethically or otherwise. And like, I think in a small way, like what we do, like I want to be able to look back and be like, we did the right thing here, whether it was by our people or for our clients, or the stuff that we would generally do. If we're going to make decisions, we need to think about what kind of impact they're going to have and how can we positively influence things. So we're not involved politically in doing stuff, like we don't really get involved in anything like that. But more so just thinking about if we're going to grow a purposeful business and, you know, set an example for other folk to follow, then we should hold ourselves accountable and set the bar high, and do the right thing. So yeah, you can look back and say, oh yeah, history's kind to say you did the right thing, or you wouldn't look back and think, oh my God, what were we doing?
Yeah, you did it the right way.
Yeah, go about it in the right way. But I think that plays out for all different aspects, whether it's like for our clients, like a huge thing for us is trust in our systems, like in us as a business. Like why would, I guess with like blockchain and everything being decentralized, it's all about, you know, people have lost trust in services or like in the central authority, like, oh, you know, it should be decentralized because then, you know, it's not just held in one central repository, like whatever. But if you trust that central place, then why not? It's like I know there's a lot of different theoretical kind of concepts that go into like why, you know, decentralized finance might exist in the future or whatever, but a big huge part of what we do is like why somebody would trust Amiqus. Like why would they want to come, and if they're asked to prove their ID or do whatever they're doing for a lawyer, if they didn't trust us, they didn't like the look of it, or the UI was wrong, or they had to look at our policies, or they had to look at us and they didn't like it, they wouldn't do it. So even if their lawyer's saying, right, you need to do this thing because you're, you know, moving home, and if they refuse to do it, they quickly wouldn't have a business, because if the solicitor's not getting the value of you can get this done quickly and easily and securely, and the clients were pushing back to say no, like I'm not going to do this for whatever reason because they're not trustworthy, or I've read a bunch of blogs about them, you know, they sell your data to other marketing companies or whatever. We don't have a business anymore, so we need to develop a trust with the regulators and with all of our clients. They need to know that we're going to do the right thing by them, but then equally for the data subject, the individual who's going to interact with Amiqus, that's fundamental. So if they didn't trust what we're doing, then, you know, we wouldn't have a business.
Yeah.
So that's critically important, I think.
Yeah, I think early on, maybe 2 years in or something like that, we worked with our teams to come up with the values of Clear Sky. So we've got like kind of 4 main values. But that was such a key change we made at the time, because it's not just new starts. When we're interviewing people, we're matching them up to the values and saying, well, actually, they might be a really good developer, but they don't seem to be, or have good examples of being supportive in their team, and supportive is like a huge value for us. It's not about like having a rock star developer, right? Because they can work 120% of a normal person, but the rest of the team might be working at 60% because they're just stuck all the time, right?
Yeah.
So that was something that worked really well, and then we took that into almost like performance reviews, like how would you rate yourself on these, and where do we need to work on? Like, so like that value and trust is one of them as well. So it's kind of key getting the right people, and then we find people go between teams at Clear Sky and say, oh yeah, they're like us but different, and it works all too well together. I was like, they've all got the same values.
We've and for us it's truth, accessibility, and privacy are the three things. And they've been constant from the very beginning. And I remember somebody came along and were like, oh yeah, we're going to do a values thing, we're going to change. I was like, no, we're just going to stop right now. We're not changing it. We've got very clear values. These are what they are. Yeah, completed it, mate. We're not doing a session to like interfere with any of that, but thanks anyway. But on that, it does just relate to so many different things. Like for people, like whether it's in the the interview process of like, is this the type of person that would probably fit in here? But then helping guide decisions. So should be, you would think about that thing. Does this make sense? Like, would we do this? Like, is it in line with our values? But the biggest bit of it is like living them each day. Like, making values-based decisions. And we do like a 6 monthly team engagement thing where we'll go out to everyone and say, right, how would you think about these things? Is there examples that you've seen? What is your trust in the kind of leadership of the business, and how do you feel like, do we live by our values? And it's always trying to hold ourselves to that high standard of like, right, this is what we say, like this is what we should be doing as well. And coming back to those values is just so important to say, well, is this as accessible as it could be? What does accessibility even mean? It's like, there's obviously the UI aspect of things, but then what's the language like? Like, what does this mean for everyone? Like, how could you get into the building if it's like, are we on a ground floor? Like, if somebody's got accessibility needs, like, there's so many different things that come into it, but having a clear set of values that kind of ground decisions has been a really positive thing to have.
Yeah. We're just about time up, but is there anything else you want to cover, or anything you want to actually didn't?
I don't think so. It's been quite a wide-ranging conversation.
Yeah, no, it's been brilliant. Let's see if I've got anything else. No, I mean, there's probably another hour's worth of how to grow a SaaS business, but we'll need to come back for that.
Yeah, I know, there's like so many lessons learned of like mistakes made and things that we're maybe doing now that, if we had done that 2 or 3 years ago, you think, we would have been way further ahead.
What's one of those things?
I think one of the things that we tried a couple of times and didn't quite get right was creating this growth team, or the idea that you've got a team of people who are cross-functional, but you're working on a very narrow area to try and help develop new kind of client opportunities. And in doing that, we worked with a program, a guy, Matt Lerner, runs it, called Startup Core Strengths, and it's basically around how you can work in short 2-week sprints, but working in like a simple way that is very kind of measurement focused, of like, right, here's the area of the funnel like we've recognised as maybe an opportunity in, here's what we need to change, and let's just test it. Like, let's not spend weeks prioritising and managing, thinking about it. Let's just go ahead and make the change, measure it, and did it have an impact, did it not? Okay, we'll learn that for next time. But doing things in that, just like a very simple, it sounds obvious, but just doing things in a very simple, structured way, and like measuring, was it a success, was it not? Like the changes and the impact that you can have by that are significant. So thinking about that's more kind of growth marketing side of things, and thinking about positioning, how you're managing that is so important. And we've not nailed it yet. Like, we're definitely not there. But that's probably one of the biggest ones, I think. And thinking about how that then links into new business and what we're doing, managing our clients. So
definitely. That's where I struggle on like sales and marketing. So I'm a developer, great with tech platforms, product development teams. That's all cool. And then we started Clear Sky, and we're like, right, how do we do sales and marketing again? And so now we've got to a point now where we know what we're good at, and we know how we work really well and how we can add value, so we're much better articulate our message and meet people than we used to be. But now we're at a point with, we've got a SaaS platform called My Booking Hub,
right?
And we won Innovate UK for it a couple of years ago, and it's been in development for like a year, and then it was live with a client for about a year as well, just making sure it works in real world and all that stuff. So now we're at a point now where I'm like, a bit like your growth team, I've got a group of people in the business that are only focused on that. And so then it's a point of, well, how do you get inbound leads for that sort of thing? It's like, okay, well, we're doing LinkedIn ads, and then we've got a business development lead that does outreach stuff, and it's like, it's a whole new different puzzle to solve, right?
Oh yeah, that's it. It's like just that a whole other ball game, and then it just keeps going because it's then you get one bit of it done, and you think, all right, well, what about X, Y, Z? And then do people have the capacity to do it? And do we have the right skills there? Who do we need to hire? And then, it's like a loop that you go around. But yeah, it's fascinating. Like the conference that we were just at there at SaaStr in Barcelona, that was great as an example of that. There was businesses who were going from 1 to 10 million, then other topics were about from 10 to 100, another one was 100 to 500, and it was just going to set an expectation of like, here's the go-to-market strategy, here's how you need to think about breaking down your approach here, here's how you're going to scale that. And it was really interesting to see companies who are further ahead than us, how they were thinking about it, what they were doing, what they had learned, what had gone wrong. I think overall though, if we're able to share what we've learned and like what was good, what was difficult, what we maybe do different, then can we make it 5 times faster for people who are maybe at our stage but 3 years behind? So then if you've got this kind of shared understanding of like, here's the stuff to avoid at the very early stage, companies should really rapidly accelerate, and then that's going to be a really good thing for everyone. And then there will be other companies who are ahead of us that they can share. So it should just be like a self-fulfilling like loop of positive learnings, because you'll have the stuff that we can share to help people earlier on, but then there's people who are like 4, 5, 10.
So you bring the next people up, right? And then they do it for you and that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we definitely book in for a lunch or a pint or something like that. So I need to talk to you.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, no, I really enjoyed you coming on today. It's been a great chat. Thanks very much.
No, thanks for having me.